in this meeting. So I know most of you have sent some recommendations from your organizations and that are representative of the constituency that you have. So I appreciate that. And I know, Jessica, you sent me some just a little while ago before this. So be sure and voice those as we're walking through this. And I can send them to Jamie as well. But so this is, and what we'll do is go through each section of the must-haves, would like, and things like that. And Jamie's literally going to type out as we go, and we talk about these things. So we can get started with. I can read my long preamble if you want me to.
I'll increase font size for you.
Yeah, thank you for doing that. Okay, the Tennessee Department of Education.
I'd really love to. This is Ralph. I'd really love to hear you read every single word of it, just because it's so entertaining.
Well, yeah, especially with my accent. You know, somebody else could probably read it about 15 seconds quicker, but since I am obligated by some mandate sent down by the commissioner to read this, you're going to get that privilege, Ralph. So the Tennessee Department of Education is excited to work with you on this opportunity to discuss the state's formula for funding for public education. Before we begin, the department would like to remind you of the following. Conversations on this topic are not intended to reflect on the current BEP funding formula. The current BEP funding formula will remain in place until a new funding formula is recommended to and approved by the Tennessee General Assembly. The public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comment is encouraged to focus on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current funding formula. Consider what should be funded in a new funding formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in a new funding formula. While all committees and subcommittees and members of the public should feel free to communicate openly, documents and records may be subject to public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by the committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula. Boom.
Boom.
Also, I wanted to say, I don't know if everyone had a chance to look at it, but I sent a memo based on some community convenings we held really right before the commissioners and then during, but we also sent out a survey, so that's one thing that delayed it quite a bit because we're trying to get a good response on the survey. And those results I sent to you is real short. It's only like 3 pages, but it's all kind of bulleted list. So if you haven't looked at that, that might be something you want to glance at as we're talking. And it is reflective of local policymakers and school leaders and then parents, because we partnered with Tennessee Rural Ed, the Urban League of Chattanooga, and the Tennessee PTA to host those meetings. So it went out to a good group of stakeholders, and it was pretty enlightening to see those responses that they had. So we tried to make it clear what that feedback is. So that's also something that might give you some color as we're having these conversations if you haven't looked at it.
Jared, thank you. That was really great. Thanks for sending that.
Yeah, no problem. So we've already done the welcome call to order statement and attendance. Jamie, have you done the attendance? So
yep.
Any follow-ups from meeting 3 that you think are important to discuss now that would help us in this to add some background or some framing for this meeting we're going to have today as we're finalizing our recommendations? All right, so we can move on now. Jamie, I'll let you.
Okay.
Am I doing this one?
I can do this one. Doesn't matter.
Go ahead.
Oh. All right, so this is kind of your timeline for January. As Jared mentioned, we're kind of on the nitty-gritty end of this thing. We only have today and 2 more meetings left. So just to give you a quick little rundown of what the next 3 meetings, including today, will look like, feel like, and the charges for each of those, what we're actually charged to complete. So meeting number 4 today, I'm going to highlight as we go. Our goal today is to really think about the resources that we have spent time talking about, prioritizing over the last 3 meetings, and think of those brainstorm lists as kind of this big, large group, big, broad brushstrokes. Today's goal is to narrow those down and really prioritize them. Which of these, all these things that we've talked about, do we really, really want to make sure are well represented in writing on our recommendations list for today? Because this will be our final recommendations list out of our brainstorming that will actually go to the commissioner this afternoon. So with this said, we did have some resources that I sent right before Christmas break. Those were put in a Google Drive folder. I think it was called January Resources. It was separate from meeting number 4. Those resources included things that other states were doing, their funding formulas, lots of different resources. If you haven't had a chance to get into those, we encourage you to still get into them prior to meeting number 5. But just know that meeting number 4, the goal is to really create that list so that I can send it to the commissioner this afternoon. Meeting number 5 will be preempted by a draft. Our hope is to have it out by Monday. Fingers crossed. That draft, it will be a draft formula, which will be a consolidation of all the feedback, final recommendations from all 18 subcommittees. So all of that feedback comes together. That draft framework will be released, and it will be open for 1 week of public comment. Just to be very clear before we move on, that will not include any dollar amounts. So there's no dollars attached to it at this point. Remember that will be the decision of the governor, General Assembly, likely be at the state address that we hear those dollar amounts. However, at this point, it is agnostic of dollars. So that will be between 4 and 5. So that's next week, because when we get back together for meeting number 5, our job is to review the public comment on the draft and to see what has come back in as that feedback, and then to make any final recommendations. Just heads up, it may be that that's a glance over. We feel very comfortable with all of that, and we can actually spend meetings 5 and 6 on policy considerations, or it may mean that we want to spend all of meeting 5 on looking at those final that comment for the public draft, and then making final recommendations. So then that leads us into meeting number 6, and meeting number 6 is really, as I mentioned just a second ago, where we consider policy, how to actually define the language in our funding formula, such as ED or EL or rule, and also consider what types of support structures do we need to have in place as communities implement and work their way towards a productive implementation of the new formula. So that's 4, 5, and 6. So 4, make a list today. Get that list really shimmed down. Between 4 and 5, draft released, 1 week public comment. Meeting number 5, we review the comment, make any final recommendations, possibly get into policy. Meeting number 6, all the way into policy considerations, definitions, and then how do we support folks to implement. So that's the timeline. Any questions before I hand it back over to Jared?
Yeah, do I understand that meeting number 5, or you said is going to be preempted by a draft formula?
That'll be next week.
So it's coming out on Monday.
We hope Monday. That's the goal at this point.
So it's essentially been written.
No. All that, it'll get done this weekend. It'll be all the comments from today all come together. We had a call this morning, and the commissioner had already reviewed all of the subcommittee feedback from this week thus far. I think we have our meeting today, and I think there might be one or two more today. That's it.
That seems like a really compressed time frame.
It's a lot of work in a short amount of time.
I'll be a little more direct than I think Pat's dancing around a little bit. I think this goes to the fears that people have had that something's already in a drawer somewhere and the feedback will be picked to align to that.
I've picked up a sense of that too from some within our membership, and I've also picked up a sense that there's a sense that this process that we've been going through has been pretty good in terms of soliciting ideas, and it's been suggested also that a similar amount of attention and transparency needs to be part of the and in detail in terms of reviewing whatever proposed formula might be coming out. I just wanted to voice that on behalf of some that I've talked to within our membership. You know, there should be a lot of opportunity for public comment on whatever the formula is that comes out.
Right,
Just wanted
right.
to voice that.
So I think part of this is also really getting ourselves prepped for session. And remember, this is a one-time opportunity for this money. So if we don't strike at this point, somebody else is going to take it. And so it's about really being prepared to go to General Assembly with a good, strong, solid case for the money we need to support this funding formula. So I think, Pat, it may help as we go through the rest of the slides to see that feedback has already been culled. Each meeting, that feedback gets culled along with our subcommittee information, which has already surfaced those big broad brush strokes that I mentioned earlier. So you're going to see on the slides, I'll pull you through them quickly just in a moment. Pull you through the slides and see those things that are bulleted are already the things that are considered a part of, they will be represented in the funding formula. So our job really today is to think about what else beyond what's on the bulleted list. So let me know after I pull through these if you still have questions or concerns, but it may help. That's my hope.
And let me ask one clarifying question.
Sure.
I should have talked about it in our meeting prep. I forgot. And also, just so y'all know, we had a prep with the commissioner right after Christmas. We had a call to talk more about, to help us understand the process a little more. And I should have asked then as well, but should we include what our constituency does not want to see in the formula? Because we had some pretty adamant responses, or I would say supercharged responses about portability and not seeing any public dollars going outside public schools to private school, homeschool, or even any kind of outside supports. Mm-hmm. Should we voice that in our recommendations?
I absolutely think it would be completely appropriate. Okay. I think as we work in this document today, as we go, because we're working through base, weights, direct funding, and outcomes today, I think we can have some sort of line at the bottom of each of these, or whichever ones seem to be appropriate for you to voice that concern. Absolutely.
Okay. Jared, I would agree. That is like almost a top thing here in our area, in our region, of funding not going towards. And that has been voiced for many years here. And I get that a lot. I mean, they have recommendations of what they want it to go for, but that's on the back end. That is something they always talk about as a follow-up to that.
Yeah.
Okay. Blount County as well. There's definitely concern of that.
I'll endorse it as well.
Okay, so we'll make sure it's represented.
Get started working through so we can make sure we get our stuff.
Okay. So I am going to let you know, of course, as Jared mentioned just a moment ago, the big buckets are must, shoulds, nice to haves, and long shots. We will be working in our document today on the 4 components of student-based funding formula. So that's where those recommendations over here in this little bulleted list will go. But know that at any point in time, I mean, when we think of must-haves and even should-haves to some extent, that's our base. And so think of this as kind of over here in the base section. So that's the easiest correlation. I did want to let you know that on the slides, each of these slides, what you're going to see is in red. There's a guiding question. The bulleted list, the content on the slide is the information that lets you know loud and clear, this is what has surfaced already. Today's goal is to really think about, are there other things in addition to what you see on the slide? Or, so there are 2 things, you can write them down if you want to. 1, are there other things, for example, other resources we need to include in a base other than what you see in the bulleted list? Or 2, are there things in the bulleted list that you would like to add more specificity? Jared and I looked at a couple yesterday, examples. One of the subcommittees that I met with earlier this week, like took teacher salaries and benefits, and they got really down into the weeds. Now, if we look back at this timeline, sorry, just close your eyes just a minute. I don't want to make you nauseated. But meeting number 6, possibly even some of meeting number 5, we really get into policy. So of course, some of that conversation may lead there even today. And if so, that's okay. There's nothing that tells us we can't. However, 2 things, anything else beyond what is listed on the slide, because we know that's happening. 2, any specificity you would like to add to what you see on the slide that you don't, or clarification even. So that goes for each of our slides: base, weights, additional dollars, outcomes, and then we wrap. So I'm going to go back up here to the overall feedback and turn it over to Jared. Any questions before he gets started?
Okay.
Hey, Jamie, let me just ask one question. When we get to the additional dollars category, there are probably 4 or 5 elements in that additional dollars category that you may have included in the base, but they're not specifically mentioned. So would the time to raise that question be when we talk about additional dollars or when we talk about base?
I think it would, it's probably going to be an organic thing. If it comes up, let's do it.
Okay, well, I'll definitely just be asking, are these things included in the base? Okay.
Sure. And know that whatever is currently, as you can see it right here, whatever currently funded in the BEP will be funded in the new formula as well. So some of the things that we're going to see in the bulleted list, you know, again, is kind of already part of it or will be part of it. So we can hash it out as much as we need to. We'll just kind of let it unfold. But feel free to pipe in at any point and say, I feel like it goes here. This is your all subcommittee. I'm just going to be your fingers typing away today.
So I think we're pretty familiar with the overall feedback, and that I can go through these, but districts should not receive less funding than they're currently receiving, and that's already been established. That's not going to happen. Maintain flexibility for local district budgeting, and I'm not sure if this is, well, I'll get to that in just a second. Ensure whatever is currently funded outside of BEP is included in the new formula, and local match should be reconsidered. Now, one thing that I've heard a lot from people, especially in rural communities, is that they're afraid the local match is going to go up. So that's one thing that I would say that needs to be included, is that local matches don't change as far as going expecting more from communities to put in if it's raised, like if there's more money put into the BEP, then local match is expected to go up as well. That's something that a lot of communities I've heard from are in fear of, and I don't know if other committee members have heard that or not.
Jared, we have concerns on that. I think I brought this up once before we first started meeting, and we're in a different situation here where we have districts and then we have counties. And so what we don't want to see happen is, because we have city schools and county schools, that because we have that extra tax dollars that goes to support our funding for education, that we don't want it to be a district funding model, but a county funding model. So therefore our funding per student, or however this is going to work out, doesn't go down to level up with, and our added tax dollars to level up with what the county is receiving, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So basically our funding level would go down because we have extra tax dollars that we as a city have come together and designated to go towards education. So we're kind of in the same, we're a little bit different situation, but basically the local match, we don't want to have to go up either.
Anybody else have thoughts on that? Okay with adding that? And that's actually one positive thing I've heard from districts, that if there is additional money put in the BEP formula to fund some of these positions that are being funded locally, like I use Bradley County as an example, they've got roughly 400 positions that they're funding outside of the BEP formula, either through grants or just local funding. So if, and this may be the time to talk about this as well, and I know Blount County definitely has some thoughts on this, but fully funding the BEP formula. I mean, we hear that a lot, that we've got, if we say, well, the BEP is still going to be funded at its current level, there's a lot of districts, and there's obviously the lawsuit going on with this, that say, well, it's not being fully funded right now as it is. So I don't know if Blount County folks want to speak to this, but I think the base is another place to maybe add that we got to bring that initial BEP level up to a fully funded formula before we even start talking about what's the, funding more.
Yeah, Jared, that's definitely how our superintendents feel in our community as well. I think they feel like right now the fully funded is based on what the state is willing to fund, instead of what is actually need to fund the students and the teachers that we have right now. So their thoughts are, and our thoughts are, that instead of changing the formula, fully funding and providing more funding is definitely a good way to go.
So there on the left, y'all can see there the recommendations that have been gathered from the other subcommittees thus far. Do you think there's anything needs to be added to that or modified?
Well, based on my review of the comments that were sent or designated or sorted for our subcommittee, there were several things I saw. I don't know I'm a little confused about which box to put them in, but feel the need to voice what I at least thought I saw in all of the comments that we were asked to review. I think the first thing pretty clearly is that there's a great deal of support for additional funding for career and technical education, and there are several facets to that. One thing I saw recurring in what I reviewed was that there's a need for some funding support for what several referred to as CTE extended day, meaning, as far as I could tell, it was we need some extra money to pay teachers for after school because that's where some of the CTE instruction necessarily happens. Another thing I saw was in more than one comment was the notion that actually I saw this in one specific comment, but I thought it was spot on. The notion that CTE class sizes, because of the subject matter and because of the means of instruction for those classes, are necessarily smaller. And I inferred from that that there's a concern that if we go to a student-based funding formula, that might open up, if it weren't addressed properly, CTE instruction, CTE might, if there's fewer students, then if we go to a student-based formula, then CTE could possibly not get what it needs from a student-based formula. I don't know if I'm making total sense, but I saw numerous comments in what we were asked to review regarding transportation concerns. Those ranged from just plain old ability, especially for rural and dispersed areas, for transportation support so that students could get to school, period. I also saw in many of the comments concerns about transportation support being important so that in order to enable students to participate in CTE and work-based learning and those sorts of career-facing programs. And there was a notion that that's not supported adequately, especially in the more rural and dispersed areas, but also in some urban areas. I saw that. I also saw a linkage in some cases between transportation being a specific funding concern with regard to CTE. Meaning, I thought in a couple of places that commenters expressed concern that transportation barriers are currently inhibiting the ability of our K-12 students, particularly high school students, to elect to participate in CTE coursework, which might require some after school, and also and also participate in work-based learning and other career-oriented programs that are outside of maybe outside of traditional school class hours. I saw several instances of general support for financial literacy. I also thought I saw a reference to financial literacy being an essential underpinning that ties in some ways to sort of a precursor to awareness that CTE occupations and CTE study are an available option for people, for students, meaning without sufficient financial literacy instruction, there was a sense in a couple of these comments that they won't know what's even possible and really won't have an understanding of why it's important to go into an area of CTE study if that's the right fit for them, so that they can begin earning good wages soon. And then finally, I saw some references to career awareness and also counseling, and that's something that I've brought up in previous meetings. The notion that I'm really unclear whether the BEP considers all student counseling as one bucket. And as I've said, I think in our last meeting or the meeting before, there's a notion that there ought to be dedicated funding for mental health counseling and also career and academic counseling, both being important, but those two being essentially distinct things. And wondering whether the new formula should very specifically provide for career and academic counseling as its own track.
Yeah, I think that's a good point to point out, that to get more definitive about counselors. I've heard a lot that need more elementary counselors, and I see on there it says at the recommended ratio. Actually, what I'm hearing is like reduce the ratios, because we, even at the high school, at every level, reduce the ratios to make it more realistic. They can actually work with students. So if you could add in there specifically elementary counselors, because those are like unicorns out there.
And I promise I'll put the microphone down in a second, but one thing I wanted to put in here, because it hit on several of these things, and Jared, you kind of mentioned it there. There was a notion sprinkled throughout the comments that I reviewed, that a lot of this needs to be happening in middle school. I think that I saw some career awareness and CTE effort needs to start in middle school, and that needs to be reflected in the formula, and also a sense that financial literacy instruction is important to be done effectively at the middle school level, and the funding formula ought to address that.
I have some additions as well. I'll tag on to what Pat said. I agree on the CTE. I saw a lot in the public comments about both CTE and college readiness, middle school, but also some focus on pre-K and elementary. As we all know, if you get behind in those early ages, it really can affect them. I also saw a lot of comments on English learners. Also agree with Pat, financial literacy came up multiple times. All of the wraparound services, a lot about facilities, crumbling facilities, and the need to make sure that there's equity across the state as far as our facilities go. And a lot on more STEM essential skills, job and college preparedness.
One particular CTE comment that I remember, I have it highlighted here in a document I put together, was the suggestion that CTE instruction might be a factor that's part of the weighting that might attach to students if we're going to go to a student-based formula. I thought that was a pretty insightful idea. It was only in, I think, one of the comments here.
That actually has surfaced in some other subcommittees this week as well. As you all are talking, I'm hopping. I hope it's okay with you all. I'm kind of hopping between those 4 slides and highlighting for you where they are. Is that working? Is that helping?
That's great.
Okay.
One question I have, or I think a distinction, you've got pre-K and direct funding, and I know our members, believe it or not, the business community is really focused on pre-K because it's a workforce issue as far as childcare. I know we've talked about this before, but childcare and also creating a cohorts of students that aren't behind all the time, so we're graduating more career-ready students. It seems like that should be in the base, because if it's going to be added within the BEP formula, it's going to happen in the base funding.
Agree.
Yeah, I agree with that. I literally just came from a meeting with some heads of our major industry talking about a public-private partnership for pre-K, and talking about in our community how this is an absolute must. And so literally just came from that meeting right before that. So that to us is huge from a workforce issue.
So I have a quick question. So the public comments, feedback, and subcommittee conversations has led us to really consider whether or not pre-K is a starting age of 3 or a starting age of 4. Does this committee have a collective opinion on that?
I can tell you the business partners I've talked to have said 3. I don't know that they're really looking at it from an educational lens as much as, well, that's just another year they can get people in the workforce if there's childcare. But I've heard that a lot. If nothing else, it's a quasi pre-K that's more just child care versus an academic setting that 4-year-olds get, but I have heard that a lot.
That connects a little bit with some of the work that I've been doing as a member of the Child Care Task Force in Tennessee. One of the things that surfaced at that level is that, while there's a lot to focus on in how we improve child care in Tennessee, that and many of us, especially in the employer community, automatically gravitate first toward the question of, is it available and is it affordable? Some voices within the task force have also stood up and said, we can't forget about quality, because the quality, we need to look at childcare not just as babysitting, but as the first step in instructing our future workforce, and the quality of any educational instruction that's received at the childcare level really matters. And I think that applies to what y'all were just talking about with pre-K, that it's important enough to start bending the direction towards success of those students as early as possible, because we have learned that the later we go before corrective action is taken, especially on literacy, the harder it is to make the correction and the longer lasting the negative effects are. One last thought on this, to your direct question, Jamie, should it be age 3 or should it be age 4? I think there's a couple of things to consider. Obviously, and this is just my thinking based on your question. There's part of me wants to say and respond that we should crawl before we walk, and maybe establish age 4 and then look at expanding to age 3 later. But I don't know if setting the start age at age 4 would deliver the appropriate economies of scale, if you will, in order to be able to run pre-K programs at proper scale in terms of having the number of students involved in order to pay the appropriate number of teachers. I don't know if I'm making sense, but
yeah,
I'm almost asking, is just 4-year-olds enough to get that engine going?
Yeah, and I also, just putting my district hat on, just the infrastructure is not in place right now for 3-year-olds just to house them. There would have to be portables brought in or new buildings built or something like that. So I agree. I lean to the crawl before you walk deal, and let's get 4-year-olds right. Although I will say, the commissioner in that earlier meeting, if you remember, Jamie, I brought this up, and she said there's some funding out there from the federal government, 4 or 5 years of funding to expand pre-K, but there would obviously be some federal strings attached to that. She didn't really know what those were yet, but she did say that if that's the route they end up going, they would need a business voice to help support that effort to get that money. And also, one thing that I forgot to add that I've heard is transportation for pre-K. If you want to put that as a bullet, Jamie. Because if you don't know, right now pre-K students can't ride the bus or ride even a separate bus in Tennessee. They can in other states, but not Tennessee. All right.
Interesting. It almost seems like what we need to do is just decide that we're going to create another grade below kindergarten that's called pre-K, and that's for 4-year-olds or something. I don't know. Maybe that's the way where we hard bake it into the what's currently a K-12 system.
Yeah, I think the key there is keeping it voluntary, because some parents don't want to start that early with their they won't stay at home with them. So I think you'll get some policymakers who'll push back on a mandate that they have to start at that age. But that's a policy question for another day. Let's just get the money in there. All right. Anything else on the base? I know Jamie's doing a great job skipping around, putting stuff where it goes, but we'll try to work through these different buckets. Ralph, you've been unusually quiet and you represent a very large constituency yourself. Is there anything that you see missing so far in the base before we go on?
Well, no, and a lot of what you guys have addresses questions that we had, and I have to say I'm taking a combination of the public commentary and our outreach to our membership and the whole spectrum into consideration. I think I just want to make a couple of general comments. Number one, when I'm looking at the additional dollars list, technology, professional development, response to intervention, financial literacy, and middle school CTE are things that the people we're talking to feel should be consistent across the state. You know, as we read it, we felt a lot of that was falling into the category of flexible local funding, but that feeling that there needed to be a consistency across the state in those categories was a really important feature to them. By and large, they weren't looking at we weren't hearing responses related to additional items on the list. Some of the prioritizations are a little different. But you guys are addressing with your commentary a lot of that CTE related, a lot of the financial literacy related, et cetera. So the only thing I would add is just to say that, you know, they felt like if that flexibility for varied local needs is overused as a catch-all, that some of the consistency that's needed across the state in those categories could be lost. That's my only comment.
No, that's good. That's something good to point out. Thank you. Okay, let's go to weights, because I think that's going to be an interesting conversation. We can look at what's already been put forward by the other committees and see if there's anything you think's missing there. I will say it was interesting. If you read that memo that I sent and looked at the responses, that the stakeholders we surveyed and talked to said they were in favor of a weighted system for economically. When we broke it down for them, they're like checking the boxes on all those. But then when you just put a question forward, do you think urban and rural students should receive more? They're like, no, no weighted formula for specific geographic areas, which I found very surprising, because they were for students in low socioeconomic areas, but in reality, most of those students are in urban core or rural districts. So it was interesting to get that feedback, that breaking it down, overwhelming majority of people were for a weighted system. But when you talk about it in terms of geography, they're like, no, let's just stick to the weights, which essentially would end up doing the same thing.
And I think that's pretty consistent with what we're hearing. I mean, you know, what we're hearing from people is stay with the student and stay with the characteristics that the student dictates needs the support.
Yeah. I'm not sure if, I think this is worth adding in the base and the weights, the point of no public funding goes to, and y'all, unless y'all had different on this, please tell me, but no public funding to private homeschool or other outside the school supports. I think that's something important to keep in mind, because there's a lot of outside the public classroom, some private education supports that dollars could go to that at least the people that we talk to is Tennessee Chamber, Tennessee PTA, and Tennessee Rural Ed, so they won't want any money going outside, any public dollars going outside public schools.
I'll second that. I mean, what we're hearing is that, if they feel that if parents are given a choice to send that money to private schools, that our public schools are really going to suffer overall as a result of that. And it'll definitely make it more inequitable for them.
And the other factor there, in addition to that, it's the worry that those dollars would be spent well, and that demographic of students would get the education they need to be college and career ready if there's not quite a bit of accountability and a framework for that. So back to the weights, any other groups or particular student demographics that you feel are missed in this, in the list right here?
As I mentioned earlier, there was a comment in here that I thought made some sense, the suggestion that CTE coursework ought to be made a weighting factor in some way, which I don't know how exactly you do that if you're going to a strictly student-based funding formula. But
yeah, you could do that from if a student is in a CTE pathway that is as a completer is what they call it, that they, students could take random CTE courses and not actually have a focus area. And then you've got students that are actually on a pathway within a CTE program. It's called a completer. It means they take a certain number of courses and pass those courses to get, show that they had a focus area in CTE. So we could designate it as a completers that would get additional funding, because there is more money needed in CTE pathways because of the equipment primarily, and also we might add, as far as weights, I think what's important, maybe a bullet under this, is to justify it. You might say because of equipment and instructors, because
yes,
it's sometimes trying to recruit those instructors from industry
Yes.
world, you need to pay them more to get them there.
Big problem, not only in high school, but also in post-secondary at TCATs and community colleges. So yeah, there's an instructor pay piece of it. There's an equipment piece of it. There's a transportation piece of it, as was mentioned earlier. Doing CTE has more transportation costs associated with it, whether it's students going to, some sort of a, if it's field trips or if it's direct student transportation to a work site that's off campus, there's added transportation cost as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jared, this is Ted Townsend. We agree. We would love to see the percentage of students completing a CTE, consecutive completers, I know, as they've been recognized. And then really, how many have earned an industry certification, actually passed the test, and now have obtained that industry recognized certification?
Hi, this is Hope McDowell, and I wanted to voice my support for this as well. I think that the CTE completion, adding in the completion rate, is very important. Also, I like the bringing up of industry certifications. All the things that the students are doing during their high school careers to get ready for the workforce and things like that. It's very important. And I know for my community, we have struggled to find, like, to fill an engineering spot. We have an excellent STEM program in one of our elementary schools, and they dabble a little bit in middle school, and then now in our high school we don't have a teacher because we can't find one. So hopefully that could help with that.
CTE completers or funding CTE based on completers, does that belong in the weight row, or is that more of an does that belong in the outcomes row?
So actually, I'll pipe in here. A couple of other subcommittees this week have struggled with where to put it as well, because it feels like it almost fits in both. And if we go down to our outcomes, we'll see that we have EPSO completion. We've talked an awful lot about, even ready grad, all that kind of stuff. So I think representing it maybe a little bit in both places isn't a bad idea. So we already see it here. So even I can't remember which subcommittee, but even down in the outcomes, there was a blurb they decided to include that says this also could potentially be part of weighting. So I think it could go either place or both. Does that help? Does that answer?
Yeah. Okay.
It's a hard one to figure out.
What is it? Kill them all, let God sort them out.
Where does financial literacy fit into this, what we're developing here?
I currently had it under direct funding as kind of like an additional.
Any more detail we want to put on that? I don't know, but yeah, what I thought I saw in the comments that we were asked to review, there was some general support for financial literacy. I think I saw in one of the comments, and I remember it, I think, because it tied with something I've heard from my own membership, is the notion that the financial literacy effort needs to be improved starting at the middle school level in particular. And the suggestion that we might have a little bit of a gap in financial literacy. We have some specific economics coursework in elementary that's geared toward financial literacy. And at some point in middle school, it kind of takes a time out and then comes back in high school. And there's currently a requirement for like one semester of financial literacy. I'm sorry, I'm being a little bit vague, but just trying to get out what's up here. And that's there's an implied gap of, or maybe it's a continuity gap, but maybe it's just a flat out complete gap of specific financial literacy instruction standards, curriculum being done in middle school. And I think that ties into the comments we were asked to look at, because several commenters, I think, tried to make a link between financial literacy and getting the students aware that, oh, what I'm doing career path wise matters, and having that realization happen at the middle school level, meaning earlier than we think it happens right now, is important to students and parents and teachers working together to have the students on the right track for them.
Pat, do you mind to take a look at the sentence I wrote below financial literacy and see if it accurately captures what you're trying to say, or if I need to?
I think it mostly does, Jamie. Maybe that somehow shoehorn in the notion that, I'm not sure the way you've put that there. It almost, I don't know that I want to make the blanket statement that there's nothing on financial literacy at middle school. I don't know quite enough about it, but I have a sense that there's less in middle school than there is in high school, and that what we're doing in high school needs to be kind of top quality, and we need to start that. It needs to start a little bit earlier and maybe accelerate a little bit at the middle school level. I don't know. I just said a whole bunch there, but.
All right. Would it be okay to say accelerate at middle school to avoid a gap in learning?
Or maybe enhance financial literacy curriculum starting in middle school, or some words to that effect. That might be in the ballpark. I don't know. What do others think?
Yeah, I agree. I know we're bumping up against time here, so one thing I think in direct funding that I forgot to add was work-based learning. So funding those opportunities, because there's transportation involved in that, and somebody to coordinate, a coordinator for it. So that.
Yep, transportation is another thing I saw our commenters tied directly to work-based learning. I think one commenter said something along the lines of, we should have this many students involved in work-based learning on a percentage basis. We've only got this many, and we think part of the gap is due to the difficulty of arranging transportation to participate in work-based learning for students. I'm grossly oversimplifying, but I think that's what I read in one of these comments in particular.
On outcomes, Ted had to leave, but one thing I think that fits in the outcomes box he brought up is incentivizing students who are enrolled in work-based learning. And you can see his in the chat what he talked about, but I think that probably fits there. It's a good spot because we're not really getting students involved in work-based learning, which I think part of that is the coordination piece of it, but also the constraints that students have. I know even one of my children experienced that this year, of being able to go beyond what the allowed 3 credits are.
So Jared, is it, so here it says work-based learning completion. So is there something here, it's like enrollment versus completion?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. All right, just wanted to clarify.
I'm not sure where this would fit in, but with work-based learning, I know that with the hours and things, and I've mentioned this before in a different committee, the fact that we have to have that there has to be a teacher, that has the work-based learning course. So when you have, and for our county, the way they've done it, it's the CTE teacher, which I think is wonderful, but then that pulls that teacher away from instructing a traditional CTE class. For example, one of our teachers that does it at high school is an agriculture teacher, which is great. But they're only able to offer it in the spring of each semester, or the spring semester of each year. That's it. And then at, other schools, they're doing school-based enterprises and things. So I'm not sure how that could be addressed in the formula. I know it goes into if we could have a dedicated work-based learning, someone who does that all day long. I'm not sure how feasible that is, but I do think that would open up doors for work-based learning if you were able to, whether it be, teacher, I don't know, it could be some under the umbrella of a career counselor, I'm not sure, but to be able to have that, I think if just for that piece, looking at that element would make a big difference there.
Hope I stuck it up here under, right with work-based learning in my parenthetical that just says dedicated personnel. Does that capture your sentiment?
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
And I think Jessica raised a good point about equity in offering AP and dual enrollment courses. I think that's probably a bullet of its own. And I know that's somewhat a post-secondary issue, and we're helping facilitate the carrying of a bill to expand dual enrollment, making it just wide open. So that's on the post-secondary side, but you still got to have teachers to teach the courses. So I think direct funding just increased opportunities for AP and dual enrollment.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. I noticed in some of the public comments, there was one person talking about how one of their kids had graduated from one school already with 2 years of college credits, and then at another, at a different school, didn't get some of those same opportunities, and that was a concern.
We got some people that are dropping off. Anything else in those boxes before we move on? It may be something that y'all have to email me your thoughts if you think something we missed something, and I can forward them on to Jamie to add in.
Hey, Jared, real quickly before I have to go, will this be sent out to the group so we can kind of all look at what's been drafted here? Jamie, would that be possible?
Sure. What
Okay.
I'll do is I'll just copy and paste it into an email and send to you all. But I do have to send to the commissioner this afternoon.
Okay. Thank you so much. I've got to get to another meeting. Thank you.
Absolutely. So before we completely wrap, I'm just going to ask everybody that's left, if you wouldn't mind to go ahead on the screen on the left-hand side. I'll make it a little bit bigger. If you will take just a moment and read through and see if there's anything else or any wordsmithing I need to do on what we currently have. I'll scroll.
Yeah, just keep in mind, these are in addition to what's already been, we saw. So this isn't our full recommendations. We're endorsing the ones that were on the other, from the other committees as well.
Yep, and at this committee, so it's just a conglomerate. All right, so if Jared, if you'll look, if we can get a thumbs up from those that are on, or thumbs down, or change it.
Everybody good with that? What we got?
I mean, as good as that can be, considering the time compression.
Yeah, I think they were
really
expecting some miracles to be worked for these 1 hour meetings. I'm not sure if everybody else has been getting it done, but if they are, maybe.
I don't think that was a reasonable expectation. Going a little fast.
Well, and just to add some background for those around here, I'm sure y'all probably hearing the same thing, but I've been hearing that some policymakers and leadership in the General Assembly are worried about how fast things are moving, and this may be more of a review, a proposed policy this session, and look at something that would be passed next year.
I have had that same thought, and just as a means of for the stakeholders, all of the stakeholder groups to have a complete understanding of it, it seems like that would be necessary and might be necessary in order to have, you know, the people need to understand what's happening so that they can provide appropriate feedback to their elected representatives, who can in then turn process all of that and make an appropriate decision on whether or not to move forward. I've got concerns about, you know, I think it could alleviate a lot of concerns and maybe a lot of potential non-fact-based opposition by taking the type of approach that Jared, you know, kind of voiced there for a moment. Yeah, I think they ought to consider going a little slower on this so that everybody can be fully on board with it.
Yeah.
More
Because
than
I think
happy.
you're just going to get some opposition based on people feeling like you're moving too fast, regardless of what the proposal actually is or is not. And I don't think that would be a terribly healthy place policy-wise.
All right. Well, if there's if you're able to shoot that to us in an email, maybe people can look over it a little more thoroughly, just with the understanding we got to get this. What's a hard stop for getting that back to you?
I would need to probably have it back within the hour.
Okay.
I know that's pushing it. Yeah. Well, I can probably do 2. I can probably do 2 and still get it in.
2 hours.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right, if everybody's okay with that, is what we've got. We will adjourn for the good of the order.
Next meeting, January 21st. I'll send you the information. It's in your calendar invite for the link. Let you know about next week as well, as far as the draft. And appreciate your extra time today, and definitely cranking out some serious stuff. So
Is January 21st seen as meeting 5?
it is meeting number 5.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir. We have to swap it because the 17th is a state holiday.
Thank you, Jamie, for helping keep
Well,
us
thank you all.
going and taking notes. Great job.
I'll send the email right now, and hope you all have a wonderful afternoon. Stay safe out there and go build a snowman.
All right, see y'all.
Take care.